The jar was already on the inspection table when I walked in. Velchovan had it between two gloved fingers, held at arm's length, like he'd found it floating in a drain. The label said starter, keep warm, written in my handwriting, slightly smeared from the condensation that always built up inside the carry crate. Orvan was saying something to the two junior inspectors flanking him. I caught the gist of it even before my translator patch warmed up. He was describing the contents as a biological mass of unclear origin, unregistered microbial load, zero sterility index. The junior inspectors were making a sound I had learned to recognize at customs hubs across 6 different transit corridors. They were laughing. I set my transit papers on the secondary counter and waited. This was not my first customs hub. It was not my first inspection. It was, if I was being honest with myself, not even my first confiscated jar of sourdough starter, though losing that one still ranked. Orvan turned to face me. He was Velhari, long-limbed, pale-plated along the jaw and forearms, with a particular posture of a mid-tier official who had recently been given a slightly larger office. He set the jar down with deliberate care and tapped the manifest entry for Cargo Bay 2. You are transporting, he said, and paused for effect, 41 sealed containers of active biological culture. 42, I said. There's a Kefi grain bag in the climate sleeve. He looked at the junior inspectors. They made the sound again. Under Orikvan Biosafety Protocol 7C, Orvan said, unregistered living biological material requires full quarantine sequencing before transit clearance can proceed. This is, he picked up the jar again and tilted it slightly, watching the starter shift. I want to make sure I am using the correct terminology. This is a paste. A living paste. That you are transporting. In glass. Ceramic sealed glass, I said. The pressure differential on the lids is important. He set it back down. Where does it come from? My kitchen, I said. He translated this for the junior inspectors. The laugh this time was longer. I had nothing pressing scheduled. I found a seat on the secondary bench and unwrapped the sandwich I'd made that morning, which used bread from the starter's older cousin, a rye culture I'd been keeping alive for 11 years. It was a good sandwich. I ate it while Orvan began the paperwork for a full cargo hold and quarantine flag. The quarantine flag, as it turned out, was going to be educational for everyone. Orvan filed the incident report at the 0900 hub time mark, which I know because he sent me a copy. Regulations required it, and the timestamp was right there at the top. By 0930, he had elevated it to a biosafety advisory and forwarded it to the hub's training division, where it was apparently going to be used as an example of non-compliant biological transit practices originating from Death World category civilizations. I was eating my second sandwich by then, a smaller one I'd packed as backup, because I knew how customs holds worked and I'd planned accordingly. At 10:40, a different person came to the holding bay. She did not introduce herself by name. She had the collar markings of Orikvan's engineering division rather than biosafety, and she had the look of someone who had been awake for a while and was now operating on professional obligation alone. She stood in the doorway and looked at me and said, "You have 42 containers of living culture." 42, I confirmed. What do they eat? It was not phrased as a question. Depends on the culture, I said. The sourdough takes flour and water. The kimchi is already finished. It just needs to stay cold. The kefi grains need milk or a sugar medium. The Jun kombucha has its own pellicle. It's fairly self-sufficient. Why? She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Your cargo is still in quarantine." I know. Inspector Orvan's report is still active. I know. She stood in the doorway for another few seconds, then left without further comment. I finished my sandwich and considered whether I had enough bread left for a third one. I decided I was not quite hungry enough yet, and I put the remaining half back in the bag. I had done enough cargo runs through enough different kinds of stations to have a reasonable sense of what was happening. Orikvan was a transfer hub, one of the larger ones in this corridor, with a permanent population of about 12,000 and a transient population that probably doubled that on a busy rotation. Stations like this ran on closed-loop water reclamation, sealed atmosphere cycling, and sterile medium food synthesis. Everything was filtered, irradiated, and monitored to tolerances that would make a hospital administrator emotional. That was the point. You could not have 12,000 people sharing recycled air and water on an orbital platform without aggressive microbial management. Every organism that came aboard got logged, and anything that wasn't on the approved list got flagged. The approved list had been compiled by Valhari biosafety engineers, who had a specific and well-founded idea of what constituted a biological risk. They did not, as a general rule, think much about what happened when something got through anyway. The engineering supervisor, her name was Death Savan, I learned later, came back at 1310. This time she had 2 people with her, both in the grey and copper of the hub's life systems division. She stood in the doorway again and said, "I need to ask you some questions about your cultures." "Sure," I said. "The sourdough starter. What organisms does it contain?" "Primarily lactobacillus and wild yeast strains. The specific balance varies. Mine's been running about 11 years, so it stabilized into something fairly particular to my kitchen." "Why?" She looked at the life systems people. Then she said, "We have a situation with our water reclaim loop." "How long?" I said. She paused. 3 days. "What got in?" Another pause. Longer. "We don't know the full taxonomy yet. Something came through the intake filter on Docking Ring Bay. It's a fast-replicating aerobic organism. We think from a cargo transfer 6 days ago. It's been outcompeting our standard inoculant treatments." She said the next part carefully, like she was reading from a document she didn't fully agree with. "Our primary remediation approach has been chemical suppression. It has not been fully effective." I thought about this. "You've been trying to kill it." "Yes." "And it keeps coming back." "Yes." "What's your water pH right now?" She looked at one of the life systems people, who checked something on their tablet. 5.8 and dropping. I nodded. That tracked. Whatever had gotten into their loop was acid tolerant, which was why the standard suppression treatments weren't working. Most of those treatments assumed a neutral pH environment. At 5.8, you were already in territory where a lot of the standard antimicrobials started losing effectiveness, and anything that had established itself in that range was going to have a real advantage over anything you introduced to fight it. It also happened to be very close to the operating pH of a healthy sourdough culture. "You want to try competitive exclusion," I said. Death Savan did not answer immediately. "Inspector Orvan's report," she said, "is still an active quarantine flag. I cannot release your cargo through standard channels without his sign-off, and he has indicated he intends to hold the flag pending full taxonomic analysis, which will take," she checked her tablet, 6 to 9 days. "How many people are on this station?" I said. "Currently about 19,000. "And your water reclaim loop is at pH 5.8 and dropping, with a fast-replicating contaminant that isn't responding to chemical suppression." She said nothing. "I'm not trying to be difficult," I said. "I'm just establishing what we are talking about." "Yes," she said. "That is what we are talking about." I thought about it for another moment, because I wanted to be helpful and not smug about it, which is harder than it sounds when you've been sitting in a holding bay for 4 hours eating sandwiches while someone's station quietly works itself toward a water crisis. "Here's what I'd suggest," I said. "The sourdough starter is the most robust culture I've got in terms of competitive behavior. It's been selected over 11 years to outcompete other organisms in exactly the kind of low pH environment you're describing. The kefir grains are a close second. If you introduce a sufficient quantity of either one into the affected section of your loop, you're likely to see competitive displacement within 24 to 36 hours. The introduced organisms will establish dominance, crowd out your contaminant, and once the contaminant load drops below threshold, you can run a targeted remediation pass at a pH your standard treatments can actually work in." I paused. "It's not complicated. Humans have been doing versions of this for about 10,000 years." Death Savan looked at me. Then she looked at the life systems people. Then she picked up her tablet and made a call. The call lasted about 6 minutes. I could not hear the other side of it, but I could hear her tone shift partway through, from careful and professional to something flatter and more deliberate, the voice of someone explaining something to a person who does not want to hear it. When she finished, she put the tablet down and said, "Inspector Orvan will review the quarantine flag." "Appreciate it," I said. Orvan reviewed it in person, which I had not expected and which I think he had not planned on doing. He came to the holding bay at 1540 with the look of a man who had been having a difficult afternoon. He had a release authorization tablet in one hand. He stood in the doorway and looked at the transit cases containing my cargo for a long moment without saying anything. I waited. "The sourdough culture," he said finally. "The one in the first jar. How old did you say it was?" 11 years, I said. Give or take. He looked at it, and it's been active the whole time. Fed twice a week, I said. It gets sluggish if you let it go longer than 10 days, but it bounces back. He processed this for another moment. Then he signed the release authorization and held it out. He did not make any additional comments. I thought that was probably the right call on his part. The water reclaim readings stabilized within 30 hours. Death Savan sent me a brief technical note about it. Professional courtesy, I think, one engineer to another. The competitive displacement had proceeded roughly as expected. The introduced cultures had established a dominant profile in the affected loop section within 26 hours. The contaminant load had dropped to manageable levels by R30, and the targeted remediation pass had cleared the remainder cleanly. She mentioned, at the end of the note, that the Hub's Life Systems Division was going to propose an amendment to the standard biosafety intake protocol to include a category for established commensal biological cultures with demonstrated competitive stability. I thought that was a reasonable amendment. I was 3 transit hops out before I remembered I hadn't asked for the starter back. I had another one at home, of course. I always keep a backup.